Natura 2000 sites. But when we look at how we're actually doing in terms of protecting biodiversity, we find, and we found this in 2010, that only 17% of the habitats and species that we were trying to maintain in good condition were actually being maintained in a satisfactory ecological state. So we're not doing such a great job. It's not through want of trying. I mean, we've drawn all these lines on a map. We also had a biodiversity action plan that was developed in about 2006, and it set out the target, in fact, of halting all biodiversity loss by the year 2010. And it had, I don't know how many priority targets and actions and activities that were going to be done at member state level, at community level. But that's exactly what the problem was. It's such a complex issue that it's hard to just address it through environment legislation. Yes, we've got the Habitats and Natura 2000 network. Things could still be done to improve the implementation of that directive, and for instance, the financing for the actual management of these Natura 2000 sites is lacking and very important. But more than that, biodiversity is impacted by the fisheries policy, by the agriculture policy, by the energy policy, by the transport policy, by the regional development policy, and probably several others that I haven't mentioned. We've known that for quite a long time. We had something that developed in the 90s called the Cardiff process, where not just for biodiversity, but overall for environment, we said that we needed to do what the treaty said we should do and promote environmental integration into other sectors. But saying we should do it is a lot easier than actually doing it. So my assessment would be that biodiversity is a complex problem. It's a problem where we do need to have the environment legislation, but that's not sufficient. We need to engage in some kind of much more comprehensive program, and we certainly are trying to do it. We're trying to use the revision of the common fisheries policy, of the common agriculture policy, as opportunities to see how those sectors can be more sustainable. But it's not easy, because you're in the process of balancing out environmental goals with economic goals. How do you articulate the value of biodiversity? Well, we're working on that, and we've put together a study with the German government and the UN Environment Programme and other actors to try to put biodiversity and nature protection into the economic decision-making through trying to quantify some of the benefits. But it's not easy to do. It's sometimes not even easy to know exactly what we're trying to accomplish the biodiversity policy. And I'll give you an example of what I mean. It says in the Habitats Directive that we're supposed to be maintaining certain habitats which are of European importance but are somehow threatened. Okay? So these Natura 2000 sites have been designated for these habitats and or for some of the birds particularly that live in these habitats. Now, you take a country like Spain. Over the past 20 years, lots and lots of people who lived out in the mountains in the countryside have moved to the cities. So the past land use is no longer the present land use. You had shepherds who would go up in the spring and the summer. They'd go up into the high pasture lands and they'd graze their cattle and their sheep up there and their goats. But then they need to take them back down to the villages and the towns in winter. And so they needed to have a supply of grass cut to feed them throughout the winter. So while they had their animals up in the high pasture land, they'd go through and they'd cut the grasslands and collect it and store it away for use in the winter. Well, now that they've all moved off to the cities, these grasslands are growing back to forests. But these grasslands are very special habitat, and many of these grasslands have actually been designated as Natura 2000 sites for the bird species that they maintain. So now, what are we trying to do? Are we trying to maintain these grasslands, which are not actually originally really natural habitats, or are we trying to maintain the forests? And if what we're trying to maintain are the grasslands, how are we going to do this? So very, very complex problems, complex solutions, and I am convinced that, I mean, biodiversity may be the most extreme example, but I'm convinced that we have really gone almost as far as we can with environment regulation per se. There's some things we can tweak, there's some things we could do better, but problems like acid rain, we've gotten rid of acid rain because we've stopped the emissions of sulfur and other sulfur dioxides and other irritants into the atmosphere. But these problems that remain are more complex. And we can't just legislate our way out of it. We have to find a way to better integrate our decision-making on environment issues into all of the other decision-making that we do at the EU level. I have to say that I am encouraged that I think we are gradually moving into that direction. And the evidence that I would point to is the new overarching EU economic policy, the EU 2020 strategy. This is the policy that is supposed to set the overall direction for the evolution of the EU economy for the next decade or so. Its predecessor was something called the Lisbon Strategy. Now, the Lisbon Strategy was a very clearly a traditional economic policy. It talked about jobs, jobs, and jobs, and that was addressing the very real concerns in Europe about improving employment and enhancing competitivity. But what we've seen now under the EU 2020 strategy is a new approach. Yes, we're still interested in jobs. Yes, we're interested in competitivity. But how are we going to get there? Well, the target of the EU 2020 strategy is smart, sustainable, and inclusive growth. So this is really a huge shift. Perhaps the reason we've had this shift is because we've had, as in the US, some economic turmoils, perhaps even worse now, but when the EU 2020 policy was being developed, there was some questioning going on about the economic model. And should we just continue business as usual? Don't we need to take a more kind of holistic strategic approach to how we are trying to promote this growth and this economic well-being and prosperity for the continent? So under the EU 2020 strategy, one of the goals is sustainable growth. And that is meant, by the way, not just in the business school thinking that means that each quarter you continue to have growth, but rather in the long term meaning of sustainable over the long run. Under the EU 2020 strategy, we have a number of what we call flagship initiatives. One of these 7 initiatives is precisely focused on sustainability. It's on the sustainable use of resources and promoting particularly resource efficiency. I think that, as I said, the economic situation perhaps led to this rethinking, but also the very real needs in Europe for being resource efficient. We're a very densely populated continent. I already mentioned the rare earth minerals that we have to import from Central Asia or possibly from Africa. We import over half of our energy. And we import it from countries that we have either very difficult or somewhat tenuous relationships with. The majority of our energy comes in from Russia, and we maintain equitable, I guess, relations, I would say, with them, but it's not always easy. And we saw a couple of years ago, Russia turned off some of their pipelines to the EU. So, it makes one think about whether we shouldn't really be trying to be a little more efficient with our use of energy. It's not just energy, though. The same overall 50% of our material inputs are imported. And even in areas like water, we have increasing problems of water resources, not just in the south, where traditionally there are problems, but we've seen, probably related to climate change, even in parts of north of Europe, we've seen more concentration of floods and periods of drought. We also have an increasing problem, because of our very dense population, of sealing over the soil. And when you seal over the soil, you disrupt the water cycle, and that's one of the factors that can contribute to water shortages. So overall, we are a small, densely populated continent. We need to be more careful with our resources, perhaps, than other countries, and I'm obviously making the comparison with the US, where apparently, you know, you look out, you go out here, you fly over Colorado and the neighboring states, it seems that there's lots of land and lots of resources, and maybe that's why it's easier to make this shift in thinking in the EU. But we're going to be aiming to change behaviors, both of consumers and of producers. We're going to be looking particularly at whether we can do anything to change some of the economic incentives that some of them perversely influence decisions about resource use. And particularly we're going to be focusing on how to measure, monitor, and distribute information about resource use, with the idea that that would help both consumers and producers in some of their decisions. So as you see, I'm not talking about environment regulation, I'm not talking about environment legislation, I'm talking about how environmental resources can be better managed through looking through the economy, through looking through the different sectoral policies in the EU. And I really think this is the way that we need to head for the future. Certainly we can do more on better implementation of some of the strictly environmental norms. Some places there are some problems, but the real push for the future is going to need to be integration of environment into other policies. And in addition to integrating into other policies, we need to reach out beyond a strictly regulatory approach and see how we can engage more with other actors in the society, including with business. And this is a particular interest of mine. This is the little project that I'm working on this year while I'm in Seattle. I'm looking at the factors that are driving decisions about sustainability in firms and companies in the Pacific Northwest. And this is very, very interesting for me. I mean, I see a complete contrast with the EU. There's much less environmental legislation, much less regulation, but still you see quite a number of firms, including a number of the big firms, who've decided to be more sustainable. So I'm looking at why. Some of them are driven by a recognition that they can save money. Some are driven by consumers and by shareholders. And some of them are really being driven by a vision of their company's position in society and their desire to be a corporate leader, their desire to project an image of caring about the society at large, and all of that includes taking on board environmental issues. Some of the things that I have seen that I think facilitate this in the US is a much more open approach to risk-taking, much more drive towards innovation, and that includes innovation about environmental activities. So I'm hoping I can take these lessons back to Europe. I'm not sure I'm going to have a magic wand and change the policy making over there, but I'm hoping to feed this into the policy discussion as one part of trying to address environmental problems through different approaches, through integration, through dealing with different shareholders. So that's what I want to talk to you about. I'd be very happy to answer any questions on that. I'd be happy to hear your comments on the differences that you've observed between business decisions in Europe and the US, or to talk about fiscal crisis, building Europe, anything you want to talk about. So, please.
I'm curious how you got to land in the position you're in. Because your bio's pretty, in terms of understanding your background. Did you come from the regulatory, legal side, or did you come from the environmental engineering side, or marketing side?
Yeah, I'm a geographer, and the reason I became a geographer is you can do anything if you're a geographer. You don't have to define who you are or what you do. No, when my major at university was computer science and philosophy. Okay, so I really have gone all around the houses, but I guess I've always been interested in environmental issues, and I went on and I did a master's in geography, and I started working at sort of the juxtaposition of computer science and geography, which meant resource management and modeling and things like that. But I guess I started a little more as a technical person, But through my work, I came to see that these problems we're facing in society aren't so much technical issues. They're about dealing with people. And so even though I think there are lots of things that we don't know technically, and there's obviously lots of research and lots of progress that needs to be done on the technical side, what to me is more interesting is dealing with these people and policy issues. And then I went back and did a postgraduate diploma in economics because I realized, well, if you're gonna deal with other actors in society, I better understand a bit about economics.
And a follow-on question. How much sharing is there between U.S. regulatory authorities and the European Union? Trading a lot of ideas. I mean, it's not a country issue. It's not it's a world issue, right? So you can be very efficient in one place. It doesn't help as to the whole world.
Absolutely, and very definitely, the EU has a much greater awareness of its position in the global community than the US does. And there are lots of good historical reasons for that. I mean, we are a union of relatively small countries. But particularly in the area of environment, and we have a recognition there's no such thing as a green Europe in a dirty world. And so I've been talking largely about our policy inside the EU, but where I've actually been working for the past 10 years is precisely in relations with other countries. So I've been kind of an environmental diplomat, I guess. And we have bilateral dialogues with the countries around the EU, because they're very important to us for obvious reasons, and also with the major trading partners globally. So we have dialogues with China, with India, with Japan, with Korea, with Brazil, with the US. And we do exchange ideas. Now, in the US, you have the EPA, and so we talk with the EPA, but the people who actually do international environmental affairs are in the State Department. So it's sometimes a bit of a difficult dialogue because we're talking with different interlocutors about sort of in different settings. But I mean, to be honest, we feel that probably at the moment it's not highly productive to devote a lot of resources to the dialogue. We're going to wait till the elections are over and then maybe we'll try to engage again.
What can we do here, sitting in Boulder, Colorado, University of Colorado, do to help you? Maybe
well,
sort of working through the private sector primarily, it sounds like.
I think it's the private sector, but I think one of the other things that we see in Europe, and I said at the very beginning, the environment policy in the EU was pushed by German industry, but it continues to be the case that certain countries in the EU, for historical reasons, for whatever, have more of an interest in environment and they push ahead. And when they push ahead, it is a driver to bring up the EU as a whole. You see the same thing in the US. It's referred to as the California effect, but I don't think it's just California. So I think that actions at particularly the state level, but maybe even lower than the state level, if it gathers enough momentum, and particularly if it's something that industry needs to follow, then industry wants to see it done across the whole country. Maybe not through binding regulation, but at least through raising of nationwide voluntary standards.
So, first of all, it's great to hear you talk about integrated pollution control, because I think the EU has moved ahead of the US in leaps and bounds. And I say that having seen the early iterations of EU policy on mercury and blacklisted substances. This is before Maastricht and the environmental competence was conferred on the council and the community. But you know, in this country we don't even have an integrated permitting system. In other words, you know, you have an activity and they have to go to one section to get their air pollution permits, another to get the water, another to get the waste. It's not integrated. So it's just tremendous to know that they've got a much more unified system. So I was going to ask you though about a specific question about the unified approach to waste and how the EU is approaching this. Now, you're absolutely right that ultimately waste is the product of our use. In other words, people don't produce toxic pollutants or don't produce even CO2. The reason we do it is because we like the byproducts of energy. You know, we use energy surrounding us. It's the in the view of some anthropologists, the predominant driver of civilization across centuries. Now, my question is, when the EU looks at the spectrum of waste management, I see CO2 as a waste, just like any other waste, like toxic chemical waste. So, are you suggesting that perhaps they have been more effective in encouraging more renewable energy as a source of energy? Because, you know, it's the use of fossil fuels that causes many of the waste we are talking about. But are you saying then that the EU has perhaps not been as successful in encouraging recycling? Because, you know, if you use energy and materials for a product and you have a one shot at it and then it's discarded, it's going to add to the waste stream and add to pollution as against using the product 5 times. You know, and so are you suggesting that maybe the EU hasn't done as well in the sort of recycling and also the other energy efficiency processes? You know, in other words, I don't know how good your fuel efficiency standards are, but it looks like they're much higher than ours.
Yeah, they're higher.
But you seem to be suggesting you haven't done as well in efficiency, and it really is much more sort of demand area rather than a supply area.
I think, I mean, there are a couple different things. If we look, and I appreciate your comment that CO2 emissions are a waste, but in the legislation it's not treated that way. But you're right, they are. I mean, it's a byproduct, it's an undesired byproduct of some kind of activity, so it is a waste. But if we look at the more sort of classic definition of waste, we're making progress, and we continue to make progress, but we feel we need to do better. We have